My name is Victor Pal, and I'm here to talk about my research. I'm an environmental historian, and I focus on the Cold War, communism, and Eastern Europe. So today I am going to talk about how environmentalism unfolded in Eastern Europe under communism and how the environment was debated, discussed, and was seen pretty controversially during the Cold War in Eastern Europe. But before we get there, I'd like to invite you. This is my website. I have all my papers here, all my research papers. When you click there, you can read everything that is open access, and I got all my books and edited books there. And the middle one is my monograph that focused on technology and environment in Hungary during the Cold War. And what I'm going to tell you about today is very much focused on that book. I'd also have some newer research on environmentalism under authoritarian regimes. That was an edited book project, and another one that is more focused on current day issues, such as the social and cultural aspects of the circular economy. In my current research, I'm trying to map out how the scientific discourse changed over time in Eastern Europe when it came to the engineering of landscapes. And this is very important in most European countries because our landscapes have been very heavily changed in the past centuries. You can also find an environmental humanities block here, and there is plenty of information on what is going on in environmental humanities. Currently, there is an environmental humanities month that is being organized, and all the information, how to register to those events, how to take part, is there if you follow the link to the environmental humanities blog. Right, so now you know quite a bit of things of what I do. I don't know much about what you do or what you know about the environment, and that's a pity. But let me ask you to do one thing. Right now, start concentrating on what you have on mind when it comes to the environment in Eastern Europe. What are the major images? What are the main ideas that you have when you connect these three ideas: communism, Cold War, and the environment? What comes to your mind? And I just give you a little bit of break before I hit the next slide. So I think Chernobyl is the place that comes to many people's mind when it comes to Eastern Europe under the Cold War and when it comes to communism. And this image is fairly and actually very well understandable. When you think of an era, you often focus on its peak, its golden age, like when it comes to the Roman Empire, or some of the proponents of communism focus on the reign of Stalin, that was the heyday of communism, or then you focus on the beginning of the story if it's a success story and it's something that humans think they can learn from, or you focus on the end when it's a dreadful oppressing regime or empire that is causing endless suffering or seemingly endless suffering for big groups of humans. And so we often focus on the end of communism. How did this political, economic, ideological, and environmental system have come to termination at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s? One of the great, most powerful symbols of the fiasco of communism, the collapse of the Soviet Union and its economic system and its political system, and the environmental implications of that collapse or that worsening condition within the system is the disaster, the humanitarian and environmental catastrophe that was instigated by the Chernobyl nuclear incident. And I think if you have chosen this or something similar, this is very well understandable because this is what people remember of. They think very, very well grounded so in a way that this was communism. And they take that moment of time, they take that image, they take this image. It's like a frozen image, frozen in time, and then they often tend to project it back to the past. So when you do that, when you take an image that is a still image, it's not moving. It's a rigid image in a way. It's not changing. It's going to be like more or less so this forever, and then you're moving it back to time. But some might say that you're rewriting history, and that can be actually kind of a useful comment to say so. But then the question emerges, do we have a similar kind of image when it comes to communism? That we kind of pause for a brief moment of time and then we just project it back in time. We use it as a symbol to symbolize an entire era in a way very ahistorically. And I think this is exactly when it comes to the history of communism. Images of ecological destruction, such as the ones that we have encountered in Chernobyl, are governing our collective memories when it comes to the history of Eastern Europe under the Cold War. But not just Chernobyl, there is vast industrial landscapes when you think of Stalinism and communism in the Soviet Union and in other satellite states. Many people associate these landscapes, these as abrupted, heavily industrialized landscapes, identical with communism, even though these industrial centers are very isolated, especially in the Soviet Union, but also in many Eastern European countries. Somehow the pollution they produced became so much visible and so much more visible in the 1980s than the industrial pollution that was slowly stagnating and disappearing in the West, that they have become very powerful symbols of economic backwardness, of inflexible political regimes, communism per se. However, one might say that this is only part of the truth. It is kind of true. We cannot deny that. It has happened. It was there. It is a very identical and important part of the history of Eastern Europe and history of communism. It is a very important symbol to show why communism failed completely and was eradicated from the face of Eastern Europe, at least. But when we look back in time, what we need to realize that this is a motion picture. It is history. So there's different periods, there's different aspects, there's different discourses, there's different perspectives. We need to realize that when we look back in time, this is a more nuanced, more complicated story than that. Yes, there is the industrial destruction part. There is the high modernism part. There is the urban pollution part. There is all these elements that made communism what it was in the eyes of the West. But the communists saw themselves partly due to propaganda and partly due to ideology from a different perspective. And I think it is kind of important when one assessing a political regime and its legacy, its historical legacy, economic systems, when their historical legacies, and environmental stories, to observe it from different perspectives. What is the consensus? What is that most environmental historians and most historians would tell you when you ask them about history, Cold War, and the environment, the interrelations in an Eastern European context? And I think this quote from major environmental historians published in 2014 in The Great Acceleration, an environmental history of the Anthropocene since 1945 by Harvard University Press, is a great summary of what most scholars would think and tell you when you ask them this question. Socialist regimes took the correction of nature's mistakes as a duty and put environmental protection near the bottom on their list of priorities. Ideology had much to do with it. Socialist orthodoxy simply defined environmental degradation as a capitalist problem. Pollution occurred under capitalism because of profit maximizing firms foisted their pollution in society as a way to save costs. Soviet theorists maintained that pollution could not exist under socialism. After the Second World War, most of the environmental problems that were visible on the western side of the Iron Curtain and in the east were mostly associated with industry and industrial pollution. Up till the 1980s, until the structural change that are now created new industrial revolutions and the society that we live in. But in the 1950s and 60s, traditional industries, iron and steel industries, were very, very important. So no wonder that the European Union started up as an iron and steel collaboration between the nations. And this was not different in the eastern part of the continent because Stalinism is based on adopting several Western modes of production in the 1950s and 60s. So it's still the old industry that is very visible and very heavily tainting the environment in the West and in the East. However, there is a structural change that has been going on already. So in the 1970s, many of the steel mills are being closed down in the United States and North America, and production is being phased out to other countries with more lenient environmental regulations and lower production cost. And the Europeans are doing just that. England is very slowly changing its coal-based regime and heavy industry and shipyards and all that. But all the countries eventually, Germany, France, the Nordic countries, Finland too, has to change and shift into a post-industrial, consumerism-driven in economy. The Eastern Europeans are not doing just quite that. There is many reasons why can't they do that. One of the reasons is that they cannot really outsource much of the production that they are doing because what the capitalists can do, the socialists cannot do for a number of reasons. One of the main reasons is that ideologically it would be like totally unaccepted, and at the meantime, equally importantly, in economic terms, they cannot do it because they do not have the necessary know-how and network to phase out, to outsource all that pollution and production to go hand in hand together to some other countries. Instead, they are joining the global economy as producers. So the pollution is produced, even if it's a socialist industry, but let's say they're producing Nike shoes for or Adidas shoes for Western companies, or they're producing tires or whatever they produce, the pollution stays with them. The pollution is produced inside a country. And then they export product that's feeding the Western economy, is making the pollution that is quasi created in the West outsourced to the East, invisible in the West. So this is kind of the 80s environment when many of the countries open up even more, seeing more capitalist opportunities. Hungary and Yugoslavia are very eager to take that route and very eager to start new ventures, new joint companies and new joint industries, especially light industries, with American and Western European countries. And at the same time, to keep that socialist dream alive, many of the industries are kept going, especially the steel industry that was producing mass losses all over the Western world. So it was the 1980s when much of the industries had to be radically scaled down in England, finally, in Great Britain. But that was preceded by a number of countries with very dramatic social cost. Belgium, Germany, United States, and so Eastern European countries could not and did not make that choice. Should they have, I mean, it doesn't mean they didn't try to comply with the new requirements of the new age, to introduce consumerism incentives, to introduce new business incentives, but the system just could not and did not change to this new industrial and post-industrial regime. So eventually, what have become visible, countries opened up, invited new investments, kept the old industries running that were polluting and tainting the land, and they were just like obsolete industrial plants from quasi the past of from a Western perspective. And a big number of Westerners, also researchers, were able to access the region. So they came in and they saw this controversial picture in which um, new industries, new business opportunities seemed to be the future, and the past was iron and steel, vast fertilizer industries, everything that was connected with the socialist regime. It was not just the old industries that were still producing a lot of pollution in communism, but also new industries. These new industries were often following trends in the West. So when plastic productions soared in the West in the 1950s and 60s, it was Khrushchev who announced that now the Soviet bloc needs to catch up with the West and even outpace its growth when it comes to thermoplastics such as PVC. So this is one example right here. In 1963, there's the first PVC factory established in Hungary, as this graph shows. And then within just a decade time, production steadily increases to 31,000 tons per year. Now it's two factories operating in the same area, producing PVC. And then in the 1970s, growth accelerates and then multiplies within just another decade of time when there is additional PVC factories introduced that are now flooding the market domestically and internationally with PVC granulate, with PVC products, and with all materials that could be produced from PVC. And the chemical industries, they introduce new pollutants as well. So when it comes to the iron and steel industries, it's good old-fashioned soot and smoke and dust that is released to the air and that the local population most of the time suffering from. There is, of course, some longer range impact and effects, but this is nothing compared to the pollution scale and diversity of the chemical industry. So when the chemical production kicks in the 1960s and 70s, as I showed in the graph, then the wide array of new type of pollutants are being released. And thus, in the case of new industries such as the chemical industry or new precision industries such as producing medical tools, medical machinery, pharmaceuticals, these are new cutting-edge products that are often prepared and developed in innovation processes, both domestically and in collaboration with foreign, very often Western companies. So paradoxically, there is very strong will and there is real attempts to change the course of socialist, communist economic development to a more, let's say, not sustainable, but definitely a more economical or more innovation-based path. And this regard, there is very little impact of these industries in the economic life of the country because there is this vast socialist conglomerate, heavy industrial conglomerate that is still operating. Nevertheless, these new industries are producing new type of pollutants, and those pollutants are released to air, water, and soil, and then contribute to the ongoing discussions and the growing environmental issues of socialist states. So there is another controversy that what we see when it comes to the modernization of the industry and the economy and the environmental reality and the environmental problems that those new industries produce. And just to add a little bit more tension to that mix of actors and wills and wants and needs, there is a growing and forming environmental activism in almost all of the Eastern European countries. And those new civic movements are specifically targeting vast anachronistic communist projects, vast infrastructure projects. So don't be mistaken, doesn't mean that those projects, they were not, or like similar projects, they were not carried out, planned, and then constructed in Western European countries or in North America. There's not It's definitely not the case. For example, large hydropower dams have been constructed all around the globe, and in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they were absolutely very popular in a wide array of nations and countries all across the globe. So it was not just Eastern Europe. But by the 1980s, the dams that were symbolizing kind of socialist modernism, a socialist way of modernizing the country and controlling natural resources, those dams became somehow symbol of an obsolete and run down economic and political system and were therefore targeted. So this dam on the river Danube, just upstream Budapest, Kapcsikovo-Nagymaros Dam, was to be constructed by the Czechoslovaks and the Hungarians. The project span over several decades, but eventually it was only partly constructed, only half of the dams. These two dams, barrage system was constructed, the one on the Czechoslovak soil. And so the Hungarian one was opposed very heavily by civic associations for a number of factors. But nevertheless, hundreds of thousands of people were activated by the threat of having a hydropower dam being constructed just upstream Budapest, an hour away from the city. And that triggered such a popular resistance that the government gave in and halted the project that has never been constructed. Adding to that story, now there is talks again that the European Union would like to actually fund such a dam construction project on the Danube because it would help and secure river transportation and therefore growth within the European Union. So this is very interesting how these ideas are being recycled from period to period. And it was not the communists who invented the hydropower dam on the Danube. It has been discussed since the Habsburg times and the interwar era halted discussions, but after the Second World War, there was again a new interest in hydropower dams, and it was very plausible that the plan would be carried out, but eventually it was just half built. Maybe now the European Union is going to complete it finally, despite of that there had been popular protests against the dam in the 1980s. These um, these civic movements sometimes opposed very interesting projects. For example, in Riga, the Riga metro was perceived as an environmental threat, as something that had to be stopped. Metro system, mass transportation, public transportation is very often associated with more sustainable transportation modes. It is the individual car traffic that is often pointed at. That is the cause of CO2 emissions and other uh, poisonous gases released to the air. But in the Soviet Union, it was the Riga metro that was taken up as an environmental agenda and produced mass protests in the Latvian capital to stop this project that seemed to be completely unnecessary and unrealistic to be carried out. One thing we know for sure, that all communist regimes, to some extent, after the Second World War, wanted to contribute to the well-being of their societies. Their possibilities, their opportunities were quite constrained because they did not operate a capitalistic market economy where goods were freely available. So very often these goods were scarce, difficult to be accessed, or could be accessed only by chosen few, by the party nomenclatura or the new elite in these socialist countries. Nevertheless, one of the main goals was to provide a brighter, more abundant future for socialist citizens that was also partly, controversially, fueled by consumerism. When we carefully investigate the images that are connected with consumerism, we do not only see an abundance or imagined abundance, but nevertheless an increased production of new products that were often not necessarily. It's perhaps not the most important thing to consume great Czech beer, as you can see on this image, because these part of the store, this communist store or socialist store, is filled with high quality luxury products that are bottled beers. The new type of consumerism that was, on one hand, controlled by the economic reality and the party elite, and on the other hand, because of material shortages. Nevertheless, this new type of consumerism was also one of the great fueling forces of the growing environmental crisis in Eastern Europe. Many of the new products that were not necessarily to survive, but to maintain a more comfortable living standard and quality of life in Eastern Europe were associated with the new industries, with the chemical industries in Eastern Europe. So, for example, many of the new products were now packed in plastic, wrapped in plastic, and many of the new plastic products were spanning and used very widely in Europe. This new type of consumerism is also fueling the environmental crisis in Eastern Europe, so as in Western Europe. These are very similar trends on both sides of the Iron Curtain, especially new materials that are appearing on the market from the chemical industry, produced by the chemical industry. These new plastics are not just used in durable products that could be used for several years, but also as disposable packaging. So in the 1970s and 1980s is the time when you wonder where all did those PVC products go and where all did those plastic products go. Well, part of them went to packaging, just like in the West. It is the time when plastic packaging is appearing more and more often on the shelves of stores and buffets. Especially milk products are being wrapped in plastic or provided in plastic containers, but also cheese or meat products and any sort of product that could be meaningfully packed in plastic so it could be sold for a longer period of time or it could be preserved from being spoiled. So plastic packaging is used in a wider spectrum than before in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and this is very similar to trends in Western Europe. And the result is increased waste production. It's the same result as in other parts of the world. There's no difference than that. And so it causes new environmental constraints, but most importantly, it's causing economic discussions because you need to deal with that vast amount of waste. You need to put them somewhere. And they don't really know what to do with them. You need vast infrastructure to transport them. You need to create new infrastructures. It's occupying a significant resources that could be put into more productive ways, means of production. And so the political and scientific elite, they are puzzled what to do, what to do with the waste. And one of the reasons why there is such a big discourse about what to do with waste is that it's often very simple to recycle metallic waste. There is old ways that go back generations, thousands of years, how humans have recycled various metals, copper, iron, steel, and so on. So the big discussion is not per se about those. Those are easy to recycle. And also, when it comes to paper, it's easy, relatively easy, and relatively simple to recycle paper. So the big discussions, there is of course discussion how to collect all these things. There is this technological discussion how to maintain sourcing these secondary materials. But the big discussion when it comes to waste is not per se about the recyclables. It's about the materials that you cannot recycle for some reason. And in this respect, the discussion back in the day is somewhat similar to the discussions today. We have vast amount of plastic production in the first world, in the global north, that cannot be recycled in economic ways. And those go to the incinerators. And this is very similar what happened because it was so difficult to recycle plastic, but it was also dangerous because if you try to recycle paper that contains plastic, the plastic may melt in the process, may produce some sort of damage, some sort of malfunction when it comes to recycling machinery. For example, to a grinder, it might stick to some parts of the grinder that the paper doesn't do, and then the whole process would be somehow spoiled over time. So not only that it cannot be recycled easily, but when you try to recycle it, it's a complicated technological process. And then, because you cannot recycle it, you have this vast infrastructure you need to build up, deal with it. So yes, it either goes to landfill or being burned, and the problem is not solved because today, in the global north, we mostly much of the plastic waste is not being recycled. In fact, it's being incinerated. So I wonder, after listening to this talk, what do you think? What are the main take-home messages from this lecture? What is that you think you already learned before the lecture, and what is that something new, something you never heard maybe before, you have heard but you didn't believe it, and now something happened, and your paradigm shifted, and you think this is a new knowledge that you gained during this lecture. So think about that. Take your time, kick back and relax. Just reflect on yourself. And meanwhile, you do that, you can stop the video footage right here because I'm just going to go on what's important for me from my perspective. From my perspective, I think the most important lesson is that the other side of the Iron Curtain was not that much different. In fact, when it comes to material realities and when it comes to human nature relationships, actually, many of The tendencies that we see in the West, we see in the East. Some of these tendencies are, of course, different because there's different political, economic, and social settings. There's also different ideology. Nevertheless, some of the main points that are like pinpointing us, these civilizations, they are, in a way, very similar, if not identical. So, what is similar? In the 1950s and 1960s, Western Europe and Eastern Europe are unreleasing wide array of contaminants to the environment, to air, water, and soil from the heavy industries in the Ruhr, in Wallonie, in northern France, in many parts of Great Britain. So, as in Czechoslovakia, Silesia in Poland, these tendencies go on parallel rails. They're very similar. But something happens in the 1960s, and it's intensification. There is new materials, there's the new products that are entering the market, both in the West and in the East. Some of those production capacities, however, the most polluting ones, the nastiest ones, they are often outsourced. They're taken away. They are outsourced because of economic reasons, because of legal reasons, because of environmental reasons, and they're transported to somewhere else in Western Europe or in North America. The dirty, polluting industries do not operate now anymore within the country, but they operate somewhere else. So that's someone else's problem. And this is not happening in the East. Those very polluting capacities stay in the East more so. Many of the Eastern European countries see an opportunity in this shift, and there is an opportunity, but not a very good one. Namely, they can contribute to this opening market. They can start producing new products that will be sold globally, but those products would not be homegrown innovations most of the time. They would be producing products as a cheaper alternative to domestic producers. So they would do a joint venture with a sneaker producer. They would do a joint venture with a bus or a vehicle producer. They would do a joint venture with home appliances producers. And they would participate as sort of second rate or second class actors within this new economic setup. And so the pollution stays within the boundaries of the Eastern Bloc. And there is some profit and there is some technological change that is contributing to a more modern or like a more Western style economy. But generally, the profit is making some other company or someone else richer, not the Eastern European factories which are producing these products. I think it is also very interesting how consumerism is contributing to all this, because the traditional understanding of the Soviet bloc is that there's no products and the shelves are empty and so forth. And that is true for a period of time. But the 60s and the 70s and good part of the 1980s, they are very much about controlled and somewhat suppressed, but slowly opening up consumerism, new home appliances, new goods, new ways to produce and new ways to consume. And this is also very interesting because it's a major contributor to the waste crisis that was already growing up in the 1970s and 1980s. Literature suggests that the waste crisis in Eastern European countries, when it comes to consumer waste, is mostly appearing in the 1990s. So after the fall of communism, which is partly true because many of the earlier systems of recycling are dismantled and stopped. But this this is not like 0 and then 100, but it's like a slowly accelerating growth that is growing of waste production and growing of a waste problem through the 70s, through the 80s to the 90s. So in that respect, This is also very similar to the situation in the West. You're very much advised to think about it. What is different after this lecture? And also use your pre-existing knowledge. What do you think was different between East and West? Just take your time. No hurry. I think the big difference is that industry is not being moved from the region, so it stays. So it's producing the same contaminants that they used to produce in the West, and now they are like outsourcing those industries to China, to India, to Latin America. So the CO emissions, CO2 emissions, and the contaminants are staying there. But in Eastern Europe, they stay right there. And also, consumerism is playing out differently than in the West. It's more like a suppressed kind of way of consuming goods. It's more controlled, more centrally orchestrated. So it's per capita, it's much smaller scale production of waste and consuming materials and production of waste. So that is also a big difference, the big game changer. But the pain points are very similar. There's personal car traffic. There is consuming a lot of unnecessary products, a lot of luxury products that were not consumed by generations before to such extent. So in many ways, this is a very similar consumer society that is being born out of an ideology that is totally about different things. It is about the well-being of the working class. Communism is about providing for the ordinary workers safe working conditions, clean streets, clean urban setting, clean housing, healthy living conditions, green areas. Communism is very much about these things, but it's definitely not about over-consuming whatever is available. And that's what happens in several Eastern European countries that are taking steps toward a more open economy, especially Yugoslavia and Hungary, but about the other ones as well. Thus, we can say that some of these contradictions when it comes to the economic, political setup of communism and this embedded contradiction when it comes to societal and environmental relations and interrelations. I think these are definitely contributing factors why the communist regimes could not sustain themselves after a certain amount of time, and why, even though the political system seemed to be untouched from the other side of the Iron Curtain, the economic system was slowly dismantled in many of the Eastern European countries step by step during the 1980s. And therefore, I think we might be not far from the truth if we say that the environmental changes that we have seen in the 90s and 2000s in Eastern Europe, they were already starting up and orchestrated within the 1970s and 1980s. They were kind of opening up in the 90s, kind of becoming more visible, but they were very much embedded and coded in the system of the 1970s and 1980s. Thus, from an environmental perspective, maybe the tipping point, the end of the system, 1989, 1990, 1991, those years when there was so much attention paid to Eastern Europe, maybe from an environmental perspective, they do not matter that much because the tendencies that began in the 70s and 80s, they continued. They accelerated in the 90s and the 2000s, but they continued regardless of the political changes. Thank you very much for your time. It was my pleasure to be here. Please remember to check out my website, sign up for my YouTube channel, and also follow me on Twitter. So I hope I see you soon and have a great day.